ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Imagine the excitement of buying your very first home and then having to sell it just a few years later. That's the reality for a growing number of Australians who can't cope with the 13 interest rate hikes slapped on them by the Reserve Bank. Today, business editor Michael Janda on the growing hardship and why the big banks have a case to answer. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Michael, before COVID and even during COVID, interest rates were really, really low, right? And it seemed like lots of young people could still buy homes, and they were buying homes, weren't they?
Yeah, there was a big influx in first home buyers during that really low interest rate period, and also with the home builder scheme, a lot of people were buying new builds. A massive boom in the property sector, unprecedented in Australia how low those interest rates got. Fixed mortgages below 2% for terms of up to 4 years. Money's never been cheaper.
Yeah, exactly. So lots of people entered the housing market, and that's such an exciting time in someone's life, right? That moment when you buy your own home.
Yeah, it's a dream. I mean, it is called the Great Australian Dream. It's what a lot of people aspire to. And it's also financially imperative in Australia, given our current retirement system in particular. If you own your own home outright in retirement, you're pretty much set. And the pension's actually a very good standard of living. If you don't, and you're renting, and with rents rising as fast as they are, your standard of living is nowhere near the same.
Yeah, exactly. The Great Australian Dream, all right. Well, things, of course, turned, and they turned badly as the world tried to recover financially from COVID. And now there are these group of people who just years ago realised this dream, and they can't hold on to it anymore, can they? Just tell me, what is the data showing us now?
Yeah, so CoreLogic has put together some really interesting data for the first time last year, and then I asked them if they could update it, and they've got fresh data from February this year about how many homes are being resold within 2 and 3 years of the last time they were sold. So these are houses that were last bought, say, within the last 3 years. So 16% of homes currently being sold were last purchased within the last 3 years. And that's an unusually high percentage. It's usually much more like, 9-10% of the market is rapid resales. So there's something going on here that's triggering people to sell their home quickly.
All right, because sometimes you sell a home quickly because you know you're going to make some money from it, right? Could that be at play here?
There's definitely an element of that. Property prices have gone up since a lot of these people who are selling within 3 years bought. But this is a record level of quick resales. So there's something else at play because this is higher than the last time we had a boom in property prices. And certainly CoreLogic's Eliza Owen thinks that there is an element of mortgage stress in that. And I've seen it in my local neighbourhood where there's been a few properties that were clearly owner-occupier homes, not investors. They're homes people bought, they moved into with families. And within the space of 2.5 years, they were on the market and sold again, presumably, in some cases at least, because these people were realising that their fixed mortgage payments were ending and they wouldn't be able to afford the home anymore.
Right, okay, so just explain that a bit further. Are these people who are defaulting on their home loans, or they're just realising, we can't pay this off anymore, we just need to get out of it and get out of it now?
Yeah, so these are generally not people in default, and in fact, Domain, the real estate ad website, has separate data where it scrapes its property ads and looks for terms like forced seller, mortgagee in possession, etc. And they've found that's near record lows. So these aren't technically forced sales.
Mm-hmm.
But what we did see is some separate data from ASIC, the corporate and financial regulator, that was really looking at bank hardship processes. But in the process of doing that review, it looked at how many hardship notices were coming in, and there had been a 54% jump in the number of hardship notices lodged with banks in the last 3 months of last year compared to the same period a year earlier. And that neatly coincides with when a lot of these very, very cheap fixed home loans ended.
Just explain that a bit further then, Michael. What does it mean when someone receives a hardship notice? It does not sound good.
No, well, it's a notice that they've contacted their bank and said, we can't meet our obligations under the contract anymore. So basically, if the bank did nothing, that person would be in default, because if you can't meet your contract, that is the very definition of a mortgage default. But there is a legal process in place, and this is what ASIC was reviewing, where banks, if their customers tell them, look, we can't afford these current terms because our income's fallen or because our costs or interest rates have risen, the bank has an obligation to see whether it can do something to help that customer through their period of hardship and maybe get out the other side. And so that's what these are. These are customers going to their bank, and they might be put on an interest-only period for a while in the hope that their income will recover, and then hopefully everything goes back to normal. I mean, I guess the issue here is if your hardship is not because of a temporary factor, but because you borrowed too much money, then hardship provisions might not be so useful as a long-term solution.
All right. Yeah. Okay. So these are people that are selling their homes because they can no longer make their repayments, and they know it, and they realise they need to get out. But there was a big concern, of course, as interest rates started rising, and of course we've had 13 rate rises, that people could actually start defaulting, and they were calling this the mortgage cliff. Just explain that to me, because that's slightly different. And have we seen this so-called mortgage cliff?
Yeah, well, a lot of commentators have said that it's a myth because the arrears rate, people 90 days behind on their mortgage repayments, is still around 0.7%, and that's near historical averages. So they're saying, look, there's no mortgage cliff. But the reality is most of the customers who got the very cheap fixed mortgages, many of which were below 2% and ran for 2 or 3 years, and in some cases 4 years, most of them came off their loans last year. Some of them, hundreds of thousands, are still to come off their loans this year. And then you factor in this hardship provision where people can come off this cheap fixed loan, go on to a much higher rate. And then they contact their bank and say, look, we can't make this higher rate. We just don't earn enough money. And their bank usually, in many cases, will give them a year of hardship provisions, and that's how long they usually last, in the hope they can sort out their finances. So if people were falling off the mortgage cliff last year, the banks have been throwing them ropes through these hardship provisions that will probably keep them going until later this year and into 2025. So whether the mortgage cliff is a myth or not, we won't find out probably until next year, particularly if interest rates don't start falling.
Tell me, Michael, another question that springs to mind is, have the banks just lent people too much money? You know, they may have factored in 2 rate rises, 3 rate rises when they gave these loans out, but 13 rate rises, did any bank factor in that there could be that many rate rises in such a short period of time?
Yeah, generally no, and this is one of the big problems that's landed a lot of people in trouble now that interest rates surprised by rising. Of course, people borrowed, the Reserve Bank governor at the time, Philip Lowe, was telling people rates probably wouldn't rise until 2024, and here we are 13 rate rises later with a cash rate at 4.35% and most mortgage rates well above 6% and many even above 7%. ASIC's survey showed the most common reason for seeking hardship was, quote, overcommitment. That was close to 60,000 of the notices. And to me, that points to borrowers who are lent too much money in the first place. ASIC's chair Joe Longo denied that when he spoke to the business recently.
We're talking about a cohort of customers who got a loan, within the lending parameters of the bank, and then through these other circumstances became overcommitted by reason of their personal circumstances. That the banks did not extend those loans to start with and make them overcommitted from day one. It was these other circumstances that led them to being overcommitted.
It's pretty hard not to conclude that banks simply lent too much money to too many people through not factoring in sufficient buffers for inflation and the risk of interest rates rising.
Sounds like there needs to be some more questions to the banks, but tell me, Michael, what have the financial regulators have to say about all of this?
Yes, well, there's a big problem in financial regulation. There's been a few key issues that have happened over really the past 5 or 6 years. Banks are supposed to test people for being able to cope with rising interest rates. One problem is that many borrowers are not totally honest with their bank, and UBS has done a liar loans survey of, they do 1,000 or more mortgagees surveyed every year and find out how many of them were actually completely factual on their loan applications, and a very large percentage are not, and that is a percentage that's been rising over time as people try and break into the very expensive property market by borrowing more money. On the other side, there's 2 federal court judgments in 2019 and 2020 that watered down the interpretation of responsible lending laws, and that allowed banks to use pretty lowball standardised expenses estimates rather than people's actual declared spending when they were deciding whether you could afford a home loan. The judge who gave the original judgment said that many home buyers are willing to give up their Wagyu and Shiraz in order to buy a home, and so they shouldn't be tested on their actual expenses because those might fall. But I think a lot of home buyers, there's not too many out there dining out on Wagyu steaks. No. But then there's probably the most important change, which came in July 2019 when the banking regulator APRA eased its restrictions on home loans, and that followed calls from the banks and the Morrison government that lending standards were too tight and sinking the property market. APRA had for several years had a 7% mortgage serviceability floor, which required banks to assess home loans against either a buffer of 2% above the home loan rate or this floor of 7% as an absolute minimum. Can you still afford your loan if interest rates are at least 7%? But in 2019, APRA ditched that floor and changed the buffer to 2.5%. But even with that higher buffer, as interest rates fell, and particularly during the pandemic when they plunged, you had many borrowers being tested on rates of 5.5%, potentially even as low as 5%. And now, of course, variable rates are mostly above 6%, with many above 7%. So people were not tested to be able to afford these levels of rates, let alone the rise in cost of living they've also endured.
Absolutely, and they're not eating the fillet steak anymore, that's for sure. In the meantime, Michael, as it obviously is becoming clearer that people are really struggling to pay their mortgages, could that actually influence this data, the Reserve Bank's next rate decision?
Oh, undoubtedly. I think the Reserve Bank's probably already been a little bit more cautious than it would have otherwise been with interest rate rises if it wasn't concerned about the amount of household debt Australians have, which is mostly mortgage debt. So I think we would have seen another 1 or 2 interest rate rises, perhaps given the current levels of inflation, if we didn't have these, mortgage stress issues out there. Most of us are either on variable mortgages or have just rolled off very cheap fixed rates. And so every interest rate rise hurts, and the RBA is very conscious of that.
All right, well, let's hope the next rate move is definitely down. Michael, thank you so much.
Thanks, Sam.
Michael Janda is the ABC's business editor. This episode was produced by Bridget Fitzgerald and Jess O'Callaghan. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again tomorrow. Thanks for listening.